Okay, I want to now turn our attention to a slightly different way in which semantic memory can be represented in what are known as associative or semantic networks. So these semantic or associative networks use nodes to represent knowledge, and each node reflects a neuron or collection of neurons, and then you have associations or links that describe the relationship between concepts. More specifically, the semantic memory is organized on the basis of semantic relatedness or semantic distance. So in other words, how closely are two pairs of words related to each other? So you can see parts of the organization of semantic memory in the figure that I've illustrated on here. And an important feature in this illustration is that the length of the links between two concepts indicates the degree of semantic relatedness between them. So around this organization of the concept of red, those that are the closest distance, such as fire engine, fire, or cherries, are the ones that are suggested to have the strongest semantic association with them. So it's closely related to the concept of red, more so than it is related to more distant concepts such as sunsets. Now, according to the spreading activation theory, activation of one node or one concept causes activation to spread strongly to closely related concepts, and a little bit more weakly or less strongly to distant concepts. So for example, if you're primed with, or you hear the word red or think of the concept red, this would very strongly activate all of the concepts that are closely linked to it. So it would activate these concepts of orange, fire, cherries, whereas you get a much kind of weaker activation of more distal nodes or concepts such as sunsets or clouds, etc. So one supporting piece of evidence, and there's plenty of evidence in support of associative networks, comes from work on semantic priming. So one study by Meyer and Schwabenvelt, participants were presented with a series of letter strings. So in this case, what I've presented you onto the slide here is an example of two different trials, whereas in this case the letter string is the word bread, and participants have to decide whether the letter string forms a valid word. So this is known as a lexical decision task. It's a pretty straightforward task, but what we're interested in here is looking at small differences in reaction times to confirm whether that target word is a word or is not a word. The key part of this experiment is that the target word is immediately preceded by either a semantically related word or an unrelated word. In this case, the words butter or nurse. Now, according to the spreading activation theory, the word butter should facilitate access to semantically related word bread. Now, I don't know how much this translates in Thai, but certainly in UK, butter is the thing that you would lather straight onto your bread, so there's a strong semantic association between these two, whereas there isn't any real association between nurse and bread. And this is exactly what researchers find in this, that when you've had that butter prime, people are much faster to respond when the target word bread is presented, presumably because this is then at some level activated and is more readily accessible. Similarly, using the same task and basic approach, researchers have also looked at the response time to words that are 1 versus 2 links away from the semantic concept. So for example, if you use the prime red and then you give target words that are suggested to be much closer, much more closely semantically related, such as roses, this leads to a kind of faster facilitation or faster response time, whereas you get a smaller facilitation for the concept of flower. There's still some facilitation effect, it's just not as strong as it is for words that are more closely related. Now, one example that I typically like to use in class where you can see some of the effects of priming is if I asked you to unscramble the following anagrams that are presented here. So these are puzzles in which you've got to figure out the correct order of the letters to make a sensible word. What you can do is just choose either that top or the bottom list of words, and you can pause the video now and just have a go at unscrambling each of those words to spell out a correct word. Okay, so what you generally tend to find with this is the correct answers for that list on the top. That translates into words such as jacket, vest, sweater, cloak, blazer, and then also a sixth item, whereas the correct answers for the list at the bottom is pizza, spaghetti, chop suey, chow mein, and chili. Now, the interesting item here is what goes on with the way that people unscramble the sixth letter, because this could be unscrambled to form either the word taco or the word coat. And you reliably find in this that depending on which group, which one of those lists of words that you've tried to unscramble, they effectively prime which of these words you're going to access more easily. So you'd expect, obviously, the group at the top, if you're unscrambling words associated with the concept of clothing, you would unscramble that final one as coat, whereas the group at the bottom, doing the food-related words, would unscramble it as taco. Now, it might seem to be the case from spreading of activation theory that all of our knowledge of a concept is stored in a single location in the brain. However, this is pretty unlikely to be the case, certainly as far as the evidence from patients with brain damage is concerned. We tend to find that many of them don't have a general impairment of semantic memory. Instead, they typically exhibit category-specific deficits. And more specifically, there tends to be a distinction between impairments for the knowledge of living things and knowledge of man-made things. And in particular, the reasons for each type of damage is impairments with living things are associated with damage to the temporal lobes, the anterior, medial, inferior, whereas impairments with semantic memory of man-made objects is associated with damage to the frontoparietal areas. Now, in trying to explain these patterns of deficits, Farrer and McClellan argue that our information about concepts consists of two types of properties. So we store information of the perceptual and the sensory properties of an object, and we also store information about the functional features or the purpose of the object. So one bit of knowledge relates to the perceptuals of kind of how does it taste, feel, touch, how does it move, etc. What does it look like? Whereas on the other side, we're storing these functional components of what does this thing do, what do humans use it for? And the key thing here is that we are storing different parts of conceptual knowledge about an object in different regions of the brain.